Um, okay, so good morning, everyone. So on this rainy Saturday morning, we have Monk Prayogshala with us. I'm Anupriya from the New Delhi Behavioral Network. And Monk Prayogshala is a not-for-profit academic research institution which undertakes projects covering the entire research life cycle from proposals to experimentation through to publishing and feedback integration. They follow rigorous processes in the development of their research proposals while ensuring that they adhere to ethical considerations prescribed by international organizations. They respect the confidentiality of participants, their activities, and expect all research personnel to adhere to the same. And as I was just talking about, Monk has been one of my favorite organizations in terms of their trajectory, their contribution to the field of research and psychology, while being so rooted in India and the non-weird lens. They've been able to achieve so much in terms of their international collaborations, publishing, everything. Uh, and from there, we have Hansika Kapoor, who's one of the founders of Monk Prayogshala. She has completed her BA in psychology from St. Xavier's College, her MA in clinical psych from University of Mumbai, and a PhD in psychology from IIT Bombay. She's a published author, practicing psychologist, and her research interests lie at individual differences, creativity, and behavior science. We have Arathy Puthillam. She has completed her BA in psychology from Xavier's, her MA in industrial psychology from the University of Mumbai, and her areas of interest are evolutionary psychology, social cognition, psychometrics, and decision processes. And her interests are more at the intersection of social, moral, and political psychology. Particularly, she studies norms, ideology, and identity, and how social groups affect us. So today they're going to be talking about their paper, Political Ideology in the Indian Context. I had read a blog post on the Society for Political Psychology written by them a year or so ago, and I was very fascinated by the question of ideology in India. So I'm extremely happy to have them here present this for NDBN and our audience. So over to you guys.
Thank you, Anupriya and Divyani, and everyone at NDBN for inviting us. I think we were trying to have this since April or so, but unfortunately we were unable to schedule it. But I'm glad that we can right now. So thank you so much for the introduction. And the talk's going to be about 20-25 minutes, I suppose. I'm going to start out with an introduction to our work, joint work with Aarti in political ideology in the Indian context. And Aarti is going to take over explaining some of the results that we have found preliminarily, as well as some of the applications of our research as well. All right. So the broad context for political ideology in the world, not just in India, is that ideology is usually understood along a left-right spectrum, and this was based in the French legislative system, where if you tended towards the right, they were more depictive of monarchies, and therefore over a period of time, right-wing politics then came to be associated with conservatism and more traditional attitudes and ideologies, whereas the left was associated with more liberal attitudes. In addition to the left-right spectrum, there were further distinctions made between social and economic issues pertaining to ideology. So basically, social political ideologies would entail aspects such as, say, tradition and norms and more conservative structures, whereas a conservative economic ideology would entail something like you wanting the government to be able to save industry. And whereas on the other side, there would be liberal economic attitudes where libertarianism would come up, or making sure that free market reigns and things like that. And similarly, liberal social attitudes, consider LGBTQIA plus rights, for instance. So there were these two distinctions that were created between social and economic issues, and Crossan et al. Also identified that the correlations between these two social and economic issues and ideologies were actually low. So there was certain amount of evidence to explain how they were distinct entities within ideology itself. And in a moment, I'll explain why that doesn't make sense for the Indian context. So the way ideology has been measured is very Eurocentric, and a lot of the work has been done in Europe, in the US, along this spectrum, basically left and right, as well as a distinction between social and economic issues. Oftentimes, what also occurs while you measure ideology is you ask individuals to self-identify as left-leaning or right-leaning, and this is based on the assumption that people know what left-leaning and right-leaning means. Unfortunately, later research has also found that people are just basically bad at figuring out what ideology they align with, and ideology doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one correspondence with partisanship. So, for instance, a very simple example could be that, okay, I may self-identify as having, not me personally, but an individual may self-identify as having liberal social attitudes, for instance, a liberal social ideology, but this individual may still vote for a conservative national party. And therefore, using this proxy of party identification, which is an item that asks people, so if there was an election tomorrow, which of these national parties would you vote for? Doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially in the Indian context, because we just have too many parties to vote for. And but in the West and in Europe, the US, etc., you have very clear structures between, say, Republicans, Democrats, and those lines are very clearly drawn. What is on the left, what is on the right, especially in terms of social and economic issues. At the same time, self-identification in the West is also problematic. So some of the ways in which you measure ideology are through scales, through self-identification, through party identification, and things like that. The reason why things like that don't really work in India is primarily because we have a multi-party system. We have more than 94 registered political parties. We have 8 national parties, according to the ECI, and there are several issues with self-identification on political ideology within India. So, for instance, research done, data collected by Lokniti has identified that in 2019, during the general election in India, 29% of people decided who to vote for only 1 or 2 days before they had to vote. In 2014, greater than 42% of people voted for the party who was just the most likely to win. And we can see that there may be clear bandwagon effects, especially in terms of how parties maybe presenting themselves or presenting the party leader as a charismatic individual, etc., and they themselves portraying them as charismatic or extremely I don't know, influential in that sense, and that may be driving behaviors, rather voting behaviors, rather than an individual's understanding of their own ideology and where they place themselves on that left-right spectrum. There are also differences in how individuals vote in local versus national elections, and you can see how that's related to the earlier observation about how there may be individuals who do not clearly identify with a certain ideology or are identifying with inconsistent ideologies both at the local and national level. Voting behaviors are different across both elections, and therefore it is a question about the presidentialization of a parliamentary system of democracy, where people are actually maybe deciding to vote for persons and not necessarily parties, ideologies associated more broadly. So the idea is that you in India as well, you may consider the candidate to be much more superior as compared to the ideology that that candidate represents. So you're voting for the personality and not really for the ideology in that sense. And considering it's a multi-party system in India, ideology becomes very, very difficult to understand, measure, disaggregate, and things like that. So the foundational question that we honestly drove a lot of this research is whether research participants and citizens are politically sophisticated. And research in the West at least has shown that unless you are part of an extremely specific um, elite set of politically elite set of individuals who are very, very, in today's language, woke about what is happening in the political context in India, you aren't very likely to be able to self-identify consistently over time, because there are several confusions regarding what social issues are, economic issues are, ideological differences, and there's a lot of overlap between these ideologies, between political parties in India as well. So coming to the present study, what we wanted to try and do is contextualize political ideology within the Indian context. And the first way we wanted to do that is to measure it using Indian variables. So the when I was talking about the measuring ideology scale, like there are psychometric scales that have been developed. The one that is most frequently used is the social and economic um, uh, issue scale. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it basically is a 12-item scale, and it does not deal with content very specific to India. So what we wanted to do is to begin constructing a scale that is more contextual to political issues associated very strongly in the Indian context. And I want to caveat this by saying that the item generation for this scale was taken up in 2017. And we know how frequently the political landscape in India does change. So a lot of our items that were included in the scale, as it stands today, were developed based on the political landscape and what was being talked about, etc., in 2017, which doesn't mean that the scale can't be adapted to reflect what the political circumstances are today. It's just that there may be certain items that we did not include, or certain topics that are contemporary that were not included, say at that time. So we wanted to write items, and we did write items on issues that are endogenous to India, including, say, dowry, caste-based reservations, and what we identified in Western scales is, of course, there are questions about gun control and abortion laws that may not be really relevant to the Indian context, and therefore we wanted to include more items very, very relevant to India, and make sure that it was, say, contextualized items in that sense, so that we could then delineate the social and economic issues within India that could be left to right. But again, liberal conservative is not language that is very easily understood in India, and it's not even it's not supposed to be, because that's not how our that's not how ideology is conceptualized here. So when we develop the items, we content validated the items, which basically means is that we shared all of our item statements with two political scientists to get their inputs on the same. We also pilot tested all of the items on 7 Indian participants, and eventually we came down to 48 items, 30 related to social issues, such as I think standing up for the national anthem before a movie or something. I think there was that thing at that time about you have to stand. There was a national anthem before a movie plays in theaters, etc. So there was an item related to that. There are other social items people from the LGBTQI community should be able to marry, strongly disagree to strongly agree, and things like that. There were 6 items related to refugees. I think my country should, I think India should help refugees from X country or X kinds of refugees, etc. And there were 12 items in economic issues. The reason why there was a lower number of items on economic issues is because, one, there is a lack of variation across political parties on economic issues in India, and two, I think Aarti will elaborate on how this subscale is not great in the Indian context. And what's happening is that a lot of the concept of political ideology is also aligned with much more aligned with social issues than with economic issues, possibly because of a lack of comprehension of economic issues and or a lack of variation between political parties on economic issues. Adi, are you taking over from here?
Yeah. So what we ended up doing was, like Hansika said, and I will just kind of briefly explain some of the stats here, but not in too much detail, obviously. We had about 514 people in the exploratory study and 384 people in the confirmatory study. And in the exploratory study, we ended up doing a parallel analysis, which basically tells you how many factors you can extract. And we got 3 factors. And in the confirmatory study, we ran CFAs, which is basically confirmatory factor analysis. And that kind of basically confirms that these factors that we extracted in the first study make sense. And then we ran another analysis called the measurement invariance, which kind of tells you whether the factors and the items within the factors make sense across 2 groups. Here we studied whether the items make sense across men and women. We did not really have a lot of non-binary people, or it was not a substantial enough amount for us to check that as well. So I felt like I had to tell you what we did statistically, but let's get to the fun part, which is the interpretation. We found 3 factors, that's 3 dimensions across which ideology is located in India. So that's purity-based norms, obedience to hierarchies, hierarchical authority, and economic ideology. So basically, your issue positions on some of these factors will tell you where you stand ideologically. That's the basic idea of this. So what exactly are these factors, right? So norms is basically the factor that basically covers unwritten rules in society, especially those that are purity based. So these are typically thought of as like cultural norms or cultural customs that, you know, what we traditionally call like our culture would basically fit there. So for example, even though like dowry is prohibited by law, it's often a very standard practice. So that kind of falls there. And it kind of, the kinds of issues that get covered here are basically LGBTQIA plus issues, intercaste marriages, dowry, caste-based issues, migration issues, censorship, and things like that. Hierarchies are basically support for in-group superiority. That is, you believe that your in-group, that is your nation or your religion or caste, etc., are superior. It includes social hierarchies, moral absolutism, and obedience to authorities and conformism. So, for example, like Hansika said, standing up for national anthem is almost codified by law. And it includes issues like, or ideas like basically that India is the best country, our leaders can't really do anything wrong, or traditional values, standing up to the national anthem, not abandoning your religion. So basically, that's the idea of like religious conversion, reservation should be on economic grounds, and those kinds of things. And economic ideology refers to the extent to which the state should play a role in economic issues. So it includes issues like wealth difference should be reduced, and there should be like plans by the state for that. It includes issues like controlling price of goods, services, and things like that. But we obviously have to say at this point that economic ideology is a really, really poor factor. It had really low reliability across the 3 studies that we have now conducted. I mean, I'm not talking about the third study because that's not really related to the scale, but we use the scale in another study. So that's the study. But the first 2 studies are the exploratory and the confirmatory study that I've mentioned. And we would basically caution anybody who is using the scale and when interpreting the results, because please don't rely on this. And more needs to be explored here. But we think that economic ideology may not really be an important or consistent link, and it may not be important enough when we are thinking about ideology in India. So let's talk about what it implies. Yeah, one is that these factors are aligned with the post-independent ideological debates that happened in India, post-independent debates that were happening while we were creating parties and things like that. And they were really distinct from what was happening in Europe, for example, because in Europe, when you think about it, like the state versus church is something that was really important for them, and state versus capital was something that was really important to them. But here, we also in general believe that parties are not ideological, what with like a lot of party switching that we keep seeing and things like that. So for a lot of time, political scientists believe that parties or partisanship is not really ideological in India. And we also know that economic ideology is consistent in the sense that it is consistent across parties in India. In the next slide, we know in general that the state was supposed to or expected to some kind of poverty elevation in the post-independent history of India, because a large number of us were below poverty level back then and like even now. And we know that economic ideology is fairly consistent across parties because, I mean, parties didn't really have a choice but to be pro-poor. So then the question was, what about social change? Should the state play a role in creating what norms should happen, or what kind of norms should be followed, or what kind of which marginalized group should get representation? And those kinds of issues were the things that was debated highly, and that's exactly what we found in our scale as well. So basically, where the differences existed in parties and ideologies is basically what we ended up finding as well. That is the basic main study, which is the but we then also ran some more data like last week, and we thought that it might be of interest to some of you, but like it's really brand new, so we'll be trying to reproduce it at a later stage. But based on the exploratory data, we then asked what are the ideological profiles in India and what does that mean? So for example, so ideological profiles is basically kind of doing like a market segmentation, but with ideologies. So what that means, like, does that affect who you vote for? Does that affect your self-reported beliefs? Does that affect your factor scores in the factors that we identified and things like that? So what we did was run a cluster analysis, which is basically a way to group objects with your people, so that each participant in one group is similar to each other participant in that group, but pretty distinct from the participants in another group. I hope that makes sense, but that's basically what cluster analysis is. And what we found is basically that there are 3 clusters, and you can see that the second cluster here, it's in orange. It overlaps quite a bit with the first 2. It ideally should not happen that clusters overlap, but when we checked with a 2 or 4 cluster solution, 3 clusters made the most sense. So what we are interpreting this is that there are 3 types or segments of voters in India in terms of issue positions. In the next slide, we will see that in terms of norms, you can see that the second cluster is more left-leaning. So left-leaning is basically if you score low, you are left-leaning, and high means you are higher on conservatism or higher on right-leaning positions. So you can see that the second cluster has the lowest score in terms of norms, which means that the second cluster is more left-leaning compared to the other 2. But then when it comes to hierarchies, the second cluster is more right leaning compared to the other two, I think. If so, yeah. But when it comes to party preferences, that's in the next slide. Yeah, the first cluster is mostly left adjacent parties. So there is some for CPIM, which is like a little over, like I think it's about 10% or something. AAP, INC, and these are basically left identifying parties. I don't know if we can call all of them left identifying, but well, yeah, we don't really know what else to call them. And other than BJP and Nota, if you see that in general, there's a lot of we see a lot of people were choosing Nota or BJP when we conducted the study. And so you can see that there's a lot of BJP and Nota. And the second and the third clusters are basically across BJP and Nota. Nota is basically none of the above, just like an option that we get, right? So when it comes to self-reported ideology, which is in the next slide. Yeah. We asked participants again where they would position themselves, and what we found was basically the second and third clusters are more right-leaning than the first cluster. So in terms of both social and economic issues, we saw that the second and the third clusters were reported themselves to be more right-leaning. And also in the next slide, political ideology, political issues in general, that they generally consider themselves to be right-leaning. So what to make of it, we are not entirely sure. The third and the first cluster is pretty clearly left and right, respectively. The third cluster is right and the first cluster is left. And the second cluster is kind of all over the place because they kind of believe that with respect to norms or with respect to cultural values, they are kind of liberal. I mean, can't really call them liberal, but like left-leaning in those issues. But with respect to hierarchies, they are very strong. And in terms of the parties that they choose, they are kind of right-leaning. So we have a little assignment or like a discussion point here is basically what do you make of these clusters? And we can kind of discuss this and more if you have any questions and things like that. And what would you kind of make of the clusters and what would you kind of label them? Because we've really been scratching our heads, I mean, for a week, but yeah. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions, we can discuss. And if you want to get in touch, it's the next slide, right? Yeah. This is how you can do it. Yeah, that's the end of it.
Thank you for that. Did you do the exploratory study last week because of this session? Because that's really cool if you did.
Not really. I mean, I was thinking of doing it for a while, and then I was like, well, now we have a goal. So
Right. Yeah. Have an audience. Why not? That's really cool.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I actually just wanted to add that this graph is based on a question that says if there were an election like in the next 1 week or something like that, which of the following parties would you vote for? And we give them options of the national parties and the and Nota. And the base rates are, I mean, the frequencies of people just choosing Nota and BJP were very, very high. So there isn't even an adequate distribution of like party selection. But the idea is that, yes, the first cluster is a little left leaning, the third cluster is a little right leaning, and the second cluster is just confused, which is what, like, literally the label that we discussed, Aarti and I, yesterday was like, let's label the second cluster as confused. But we know that that can't be done. So any inputs would be pretty good.
Right. So you talked about that political sophistication thing, right? That certain elite people are more likely to, like, I even read in your paper that there's the congruency between awareness of ideology and who you vote for is quite low, and especially in India, like where economic issues like don't even play into that picture. So in this cluster analysis and the recent exploratory study, I don't know if I missed that slide, but what is the existing awareness that people already had of ideologies to who they'd vote for?
So we asked them, I mean, we didn't give them like a scale or something to measure awareness, but we did ask them how aware you are, like to report it on like one item, but there was no significant difference between clusters. And
It was, I think there were two: how aware are you about politics and how interested are you in politics.
Mm.
We had those two items, but it was only a single point estimate.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I got introduced to this topic of political psychology through Jonathan Haidt's paper on moral intuitions and so and so. So his moral foundations theory, actually, why good people are divided, that book, The Righteous Mind, that always comes to my mind. And his moral foundations theory that had these five variables, like, purity versus this. And interestingly, like two of them came from India because he visited Orissa in the 80s, and the purity thing actually came from India. So when I saw your paper and I saw that you were developing a whole new scale for India, I was very intrigued because I was like, okay, even Jonathan Haidt, like when he, and there was a uh, this study someone did to look at the cultural applicability of his scale as well. So that's something that just came to mind, and I was like, yeah, we need more of these, basically like adaptations and creations of new scales. That's what makes psychology inclusive. Do we have any questions from the audience? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I can ask for the question. Hi,
Hi, sure, go ahead.
my uh, just a second. Okay, yeah. I'm not sure if you've not directly dealt with this, but I am in some sense studying the rise of political polarization in India. So I just wanted to ask your opinions on it based on your study. Could you hint at something that you found interesting, or is there some trend that you can think of vis-a-vis the rise of political polarization among people? Or rise in extremism in some sense? Am,
um,
am I
we,
clear?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
We didn't directly study it, but it's
yeah,
obviously like of interest to us as well. Um, but I mean, we really don't have answers from this study at all about polarization.
yeah, sure. I just wanted
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
But I also think that what we're trying to do is define those poles first to understand along what dimensions people are being polarized. So is it along very, because clearly it's not along economic dimensions, because there's a lot of consistency on economic ideology across parties. So if we have to deep dive into the social dimensions along which polarization is occurring, at least now we have these higher order dimensions of purity based norms and obedience to hierarchies, along which we can then do further research about figuring out where, like, what are the poles between which the polarization is happening. But we haven't done any of that research.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for asking. Torsha messaged me. She's in traffic, so she can't unmute herself. She has a question. Do we have an understanding of the demographic distribution of the people who responded? I'm thinking she's asking from the recent last week's survey. I had the same question. Okay, so we have it here, is it?
I don't know if it presented it here, but for the first study, the exploratory study, we did not measure a lot of things because there were a lot of questions to be answered in general. So we did have like age and gender. But for the second study, we do have a lot more nitty-gritties, which is there in the paper. Unfortunately, that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's there in the appendix. And it was, I mean, as you would expect, kind of there were a lot more people who were I mean, I think gender wise it was distributed okay. But in terms of caste and things like that, as you would expect, it was not really greatly distributed. We also, with respect to religion, I think a lot more than those. I mean, that is kind of similar to what we do know with respect to the census, but yeah. But there is more concrete answers in the paper.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Any other audience questions?
Hi, I was very interested in this cluster two that you guys described, the confused cluster, and I was wondering what you have in mind for them going forward, because from what I can see, like Hansika, you mentioned you're looking at what exactly these poles are, right, before we can figure out what that polarization looks like and how it happens, just to try and understand what these different poles are. And I could be completely off base, but how much of exploring this cluster two is going to help with identifying those poles? And because I think anecdotal evidence wise, I see what you mean, right? A lot of these decisions that we make about voting for parties doesn't necessarily come from reading party manifestos or understanding what it is that the people what these parties are saying they will do once they are in office. But so I think this is an incredible kind of effort, but I'm just very interested to know where this second cluster is going to take us. So I just wanted to know what you guys have in mind for them going forward.
I can start, and Aarti, please add here, because this is a very interesting pattern of behavior that the second cluster is displaying, because very clearly they have more not liberal, left leaning attitudes towards purity based norms. So LGBTQI rights, or I think migration is also included in this cluster, or and things like that. Whereas the obedience to hierarchy is very, very conservative. So it's, I would actually be very interested in knowing the more demographic characteristics of cluster two, to try and understand whether it's well, younger people um, who are trying to straddle these two domains between, okay, I want to be left leaning in terms of like being more woke, etc., but the obedience to hierarchy is so integral to Indian kind of culture and society, etc., that it is communicated all the time. We're institutionalized to respect hierarchical institutions, and there is a very high power distance dynamic in India, as well as a cultural orientation and things like that. So I think definitely exploring demographic characteristics and then taking this forward to try and figure out who these people are, because they clearly are very different from cluster one and cluster two, who are a little more congruent in terms of their ideologies, where cluster one is mostly left leaning, cluster three is mostly right leaning on the other two factors also. But the interesting thing is why this disparity is coming up. So yeah, I think that's definitely next step.
Maybe it's very, I mean, this is just, I mean, you don't go by what I'm saying, but it's very likely that people who are right leaning in terms of hierarchies are the people who are voting for like right-leaning parties in India, because they are also like very clearly self-positioning themselves as right-leaning, which also goes on to say that maybe, I mean, maybe when we are voting for, say, like a particular right-leaning party, we are looking for their very clear instructions about this is what's going to go into the law in terms compared to what the other things are. So when we are saying that, hey, when you are voting for the BJP, you hate Muslims, probably that's not the case. What they want is what they are basically trying to see is that like the traditional values of India are being upheld, which is probably diverse. I mean, we can't really say based on this because like the number of people who have voted for the parties and things like that are kind of all over the place. But yeah, that is possibility. But
I based on what you said, AR, actually I had another idea in terms of what we can do, and I'm sorry, but this is how brainstorming happens. What we can do is try and figure out whether the items based on norms, how many of those are codified by law, and how many of the items based on obedience to hierarchy are codified by law, and try and figure out whether there's a distinction there that's explaining that there are more implicit things that people are liberal about in cluster 2, but the more explicit things that are codified by law like needs to be upheld by hierarchy. That yeah.
Thanks, guys. No, this is really cool. I hope you guys get some good answers for this effort. That's all. Thanks. Sorry, Anu, back to you.
Any more questions from the audience? So Jafar is asking in the chat, would it be safe to assume that the majority of population that actually votes don't know or cannot yet process how these concept of ideologies reflect in our society, and those who don't know don't engage much in voting? So I think the first part you had addressed in your paper and just spoke about lack of ideological awareness, and yet people take partisan positions, and I'm not sure about the second part. Yeah.
I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I don't think we can say that based on the study for sure. And it's very, I mean, we usually, when we do science, it's like very easy to say that people are stupid and they don't know anything. But I don't think that is the thing that we are arguing either. We just don't know for sure on what basis people are voting. Unfortunately, that still stands. We wanted to study ideology in very kind of separated from partisanship, because we don't know what drives partisanship, and we definitely don't know what drives partisanship in India. So that was basically our idea.
And just to add to that, I think it's a generalization and an assumption that we're not comfortable making, primarily because the sample that we got was basically English speaking netizens in India, and mostly young people. Average age I don't know, might be like 28 or something, but there's definitely going to be different patterns that come up in terms of first time voters and people who are older. So there are definitely going to be very clear demographic differences that arise based on age and gender and all of these other social demographic variables. So I don't think a generalization as in people don't know who they're voting for, or and people who know they don't engage with politics enough, or we wouldn't be comfortable making that assumption based on the results of our study, and we haven't found evidence for that in the Indian context based on our literature. I hope that helps.
And also the fact that people just vote for different parties locally and nationally is very interesting. I don't know. I don't see a lot of research being done in this area, but there is some.
Wait, Arthi, did you just address Fazli Salim's question? Are ideological differences more clear? Okay, so
No. That is just in
yeah,
continuation.
yeah. Sorry. Are ideological differences more clear in developed countries than here? And are there studies addressing this? Is what he's asked.
So the the only thing is that not necessarily developed countries, but a lot of political ideology work happens in the US and Western Europe. So there is a lot more insight into what's actually happening with respect to ideological differences, even across time there compared to what we actually know here. With respect to ideological differences, not to say that there is no political science research, there is a lot of it, but obviously we don't see it from like a political psychology kind of idea or like an ideological kind of.
And also, if the question was like, are the distinctions clearer there than here? I think it's still messy there. It's just that it really depends on the structure of I mean, democracy in that sense. Because very clearly in the US, you would have these two individuals who are facing off each other, and there are two major parties, etc. So it's more complicated in India, and it's messier in India, particularly because we have one, so many national parties, two, so many coalitions, that and all of that is in a state of flux basically all the time. And it's not that a coalition is only going to be formed through people who are ideologically similar in terms of parties as well. So that's the confusing part, and that's what we're trying to explore.
Tosha is asking, there's some literature on how a lot of vote share depends on last minute vote buying in the form of gifts, cash, and biryani. How do we think ideological inclinations affect such small but significant measures? Interesting.
So again, ideology, political ideology, the way we have kind of constructed is basically like attitudes, perception, morality, that angle compared to like partisanship angle. So we do know that partisanship is very flaky. I won't say flaky. I mean, that's definitely not the word we should quote here. But yeah, it's kind of flaky. We know that. That so we don't think the ideology itself would change that much, but yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of got distracted by the next question.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but Tosha's question is pretty interesting also compared to what you guys said, that a lot of people make their decisions 1 or 2 days in advance. So that's also when all the biryanis and stuff is given out. So
What to do with
maybe that.
incentives also, right? I think if people don't already have an ideological inclination, then their vote is easily like you can buy the vote. That means you can nudge it because the existing belief isn't strong in a certain ideology. So when your values or beliefs are very loose, you can be pulled into any direction based on incentive, and material incentive in this case, rather than a policy long term vision kind of incentive. Am I right?
Kind of, I would also say that the ideology in itself, yes, may not be well structured or well formed, or the person may not have enough metacognitive ability to know that this is my ideology, and therefore may get swayed. But also at the same time, I want to bring up the topic of, say, the presidentialization of a parliamentary democracy, where people are voting for the persona, I mean for the person, and not necessarily for the ideologies associated with the party in itself. So that's what
Uh, yeah, I think.
I would also say, I mean, sorry.
No, please come.
I would also say that like even if you know what your ideology is, you may not know what the ideology of the party or the person who is supposed to be your elected representative is. So that might also, I mean, uh, what's the book, in the book Train to Pakistan? I remember like reading this like years ago, and damn, I can't remember the author's name, but he basically said, like it really didn't matter when like the British, like the people who were ruling us changed from like the British to Nehru, because essentially nothing basically changed for the day-to-day people. So it's basically like that. Like even if, I mean, you may not necessarily know whether changing parties is going to help you go in a particular direction, or go for your day-to-day life. It may not really reflect unless you are politically sophisticated enough and you know exactly this is what I want, or this is what I want my leaders to be, and say that. This is just a thought. This is not coming up from any empirical bodies.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when you say a party, when someone votes for the persona and the person rather than the party and the policy, it's also been studied a lot in political science, like the whole populism thing and deflection. Like when someone changes their party, should they get to keep their seat because they're the person in a FTPT system versus which is something I even worked on with you guys last year with the variables that I was coding. Anyway, so we have Kashish raising her hand, and Surjodev has a question in the chat. Let's go with Surjodev's. How does Israeli politics compare? Also, multi-party in Europe, and then we'll get to you, Kashish.
Honestly, no idea about Israeli political ideology work at all. So can't really say much about it. There is some, I mean, from what I've heard of political psychologists talking about in Germany also, it's basically the same thing, that even though there is a multi-party system, it doesn't really, I mean, the existing ideological positions or things like that doesn't really translate that well into Germany, uh, either, because we have a multi-party system, and the way ideology works in Germany may be completely different from how it works in the US, where a lot of this work is also happening. Yeah. So the answer to both questions, I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Uh, I think with Israel, like there's a very, like it's been studied so much, the whole Palestine issue, and how most of ideology, most of social psychology studies I've seen in conflict and social psychology have been in the Israeli context. So I'm happy to share some papers on that later, Surjodev, and some summaries that I've written for those. Now we can get to Kashish's question, who's been raising her hand. Kashish, you can unmute.
Yeah, hi. Okay, it's not more of a question, but an experience that I'll quickly like to share. It's a local context, something experience that I want to share. So this time when MC elections were happening and all three people were standing from my own society, like somebody for the Aam Aadmi Party, and then there was this another person for Congress and the third person for BJP. So it was quite interesting to see how a lot of society members were like really going for the persona of the person, the leadership style that the person carries, and also the consistency, like in terms of, if they are going to really, implement and materialize the things that they are saying. So, and even the way they were campaigning door to door, because this is quite natural. I mean, this happens a lot. At least, so I am from Punjab, and this is something that I have observed very much, that during elections, irrespective of whatever level those elections are happening, this door to door campaigning and also the events, there are also some music nights that these people organize. Yeah. Also, a question that I would like to ask, and I understand that it might not be the right context here. So, in terms of that, do you think that policy as an objective can really be worked upon? Is there some research that is happening for making honesty as an like when I mean in terms of whatever policies are drafted, that that there is an element of honesty to drive people as well as the leaders to really stick to what they are vouching for.
Uh, that's a great question, but I mean, the thing with uh, the thing with making promises is just that, right? Like they can be empty, and there is no. I mean, I don't know whether there's any policy implications to. I mean, of course, there are policy implications to our work, but not necessarily in the domain of trying to figure out how, I don't know, in a very blunt way to make politicians more honest. But yeah, that's a great question. I unfortunately do not have the answer.
I think a lot of the questions are overlapping on like political science, and these things have been studied. I know Professor Gilles Vernier from Ashoka, who used to teach us, they have a center called Trivedi Center for Political Data, where I think they're trying to map like the littlest and the most interesting things. I mean, not littlest, but like very nuanced things. So that's like another portal and section, like a think tank to look at, because there are people studying a lot of these things, like not just voter behavior but politician behavior and the psychology of politicians themselves. And I know JPAL is doing a study right now. JPAL has a behavioral development lab, and they're looking at bureaucrats psychology and something around behavior science there. So yeah, but nevertheless, great questions. Anyone else? We're at 12:03 right now, so technically we should be done. If there's no more questions, then we can just conclude and move on. What do you say, Divyani, Hansika, Arthi?
Yep, sounds good. In case no one else has any questions, even if you do, you can always reach out to Arti and Hansika. I've shared their email IDs. You can write them to us, and we'd be happy to get back to you. But thank you guys so much. It was such an interesting session. I really enjoyed myself.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for doing this. I think this was very productive, and we should put up the video, like the recording soon, and we'll be sharing that on our channels. And thank you for everyone else coming in and asking and being so attentive. Have a nice Saturday. I will stop recording now. Thank you.